Lena had always been a light sleeper, prone to vivid dreams and night terrors. But one particular experience would stay with her for years, and it all began on a seemingly ordinary night. She had just moved into a new apartment and was trying to adjust to her new surroundings. The place was small, but it was cozy, and Lena had no reason to feel uneasy. That was until she started hearing strange noises in the middle of the night, creaking sounds that seemed to come from beneath her bed. At first, she thought it was just the apartment settling, but the noises grew louder and more persistent. One night, while trying to sleep, Lena heard the sound of breathing, low, heavy breaths, coming from directly under her bed. Her heart raced, and she felt the familiar sensation of sleep paralysis beginning to set in. She couldn't move, couldn't scream, and could only listen as the breathing grew louder, closer. When she finally managed to turn her head, her eyes locked on something that made her blood run cold. A pair of eyes staring up at her from beneath the bed. They were cold, calculating, and glowed faintly in the darkness. The figure didn't move, but Lena could feel its presence, something sinister watching her every move. For weeks, the night terrors continued, and the figure under the bed never left. It wasn't until she moved out of the apartment that the presence seemed to fade away, but Lena often finds herself checking under her bed before she sleeps, just in case. James had always been a heavy sleeper, but one night, everything changed. He was staying at his grandmother's old farmhouse in the countryside, a place steeped in history and local legends. The area was known for tales of strange occurrences, particularly the haunting of a banshee that was said to wail before a death occurred. It was just after midnight when James woke up suddenly, gasping for breath. His heart raced, and he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. In the darkness of his room, he could hear the faintest sound, a low, sorrowful wail that seemed to echo through the house. He thought it was the wind at first, but as the sound grew louder, James realized it was a cry of despair, unnatural and haunting. Frozen with fear, he tried to turn on the light, but his body wouldn't respond. His limbs felt heavy, and his vision blurred. The wailing continued, growing in intensity. Then, in the corner of his room, James saw something that made his blood run cold. A pale, ghostly figure of a woman, her face twisted in agony as she wept. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her mouth moved in silent screams. The banshee, a spectral entity, seemed to know James was awake, and as he lay paralyzed in terror, the wailing reached its crescendo. The last thing he heard before everything went silent was the chilling words, "Death is near." James left the farmhouse that morning, shaken to the core, and refused to return. The banshee's cry had not only haunted his sleep, but had left an indelible mark on his mind. To this day, he wonders if the ghostly figure was a warning of something to come. When Sarah was in her early 20s, she began experiencing something that would haunt her every night, a shadowy figure that appeared at the end of the hallway outside her bedroom. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination playing tricks on her during sleep. But as the weeks went by, the figure became more persistent, always appearing at the same time, just as Sarah began to drift into sleep. Each night, the figure seemed to move closer to her room, its silhouette dark and ominous. The most unsettling part was that she couldn't seem to wake up. It felt as if her body was frozen, trapped in a waking nightmare where she could see everything but was unable to move or scream for help. As her sleep paralysis worsened, Sarah started to hear faint whispers accompanying the shadow, voices that seemed to speak directly into her mind. Desperate for relief, Sarah visited a sleep clinic, only to learn that she was suffering from extreme night terrors and sleep paralysis. However, what the doctors couldn't explain was the unnerving sense that someone, or something, was watching her. Despite medication and therapy, Sarah's experiences persisted, and she often woke up with bruises on her arms as if something had grabbed her during the night. It wasn't until Sarah moved to a new house that the shadows seemed to stop following her. But to this day, whenever she feels particularly stressed or anxious, she can still feel the weight of something unseen, lurking just out of sight in the dark corners of her room. Marie had always been a calm, rational person, but her experiences with night terrors shattered her perception of reality. It began when she started hearing a lullaby, soft, gentle, and soothing, every night as she tried to fall asleep. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, a soothing memory from her childhood. But the lullaby soon became more than just a song. It became an unsettling presence. The lullaby seemed to play from somewhere deep in her room, but Marie couldn't find the source. It wasn't a melody she recognized, and it felt wrong somehow, as if it were trying to lull her into a false sense of security. As the nights went on, the lullaby became louder and more insistent, as if trying to draw her attention to something. One night, as she lay in bed, her eyes fluttered open in the darkness. The lullaby was playing once again, but this time, Marie could see a figure standing at the foot of her bed. The figure was shrouded in shadows, its face hidden in the dim light. The lullaby seemed to come from this figure, its mouth moving as if singing the song directly into her mind. Marie tried to scream, but once again, she was paralyzed, unable to move or make a sound. The lullaby continued to play, and the figure's presence felt suffocating. The last thing Marie remembered before blacking out was the figure bending down close to her, whispering, "Sleep forever." When she woke up the next morning, the lullaby had stopped, but the fear lingered. To this day, Marie can't shake the feeling that the lullaby is still there, waiting to return. In 2013, Elisa Lam, a 21-year-old student, checked into the Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles. Known for its dark history of suicides and violence, the hotel's reputation loomed heavy. Days later, Elisa disappeared, sparking a frantic search. The last known footage of her came from an elevator surveillance camera. In the video, Elisa displayed bizarre behavior, pressing random buttons, peering around as if being followed, and making strange hand gestures. Weeks later, her decomposing body was found in a rooftop water tank after guests complained about the water's foul taste. Investigators were baffled. The tank was sealed, requiring significant effort to access, and there was no logical explanation for how Elisa could have gotten there. Was it foul play, a mental breakdown, or something paranormal? The eerie twist: past guests reported seeing ghostly figures in the hallways, and some believe the building's dark energy consumed her. In 2014, the Broaddus family purchased their dream home in Westfield, New Jersey, a picturesque suburban neighborhood. Days after moving in, they received a chilling letter from someone calling themselves the Watcher. The letter was detailed, referencing the couple's children and expressing an obsessive interest in the house. "Do you know what lies within the walls?" one letter ominously asked. As the letters continued, they became more threatening, suggesting the Watcher was waiting for the young blood to arrive. The Broaddus family discovered that the previous owners had also received similar letters, but chose to remain silent. When investigators delved deeper, they uncovered rumors of satanic cults in the area during the 1980s. No suspects were ever identified, and the Broaddus family eventually sold the home at a loss. Some locals speculate the Watcher was someone close by, still watching, waiting. In 1872, the Mary Celeste was found drifting in the Atlantic Ocean, its sails intact, cargo undisturbed, and no crew aboard. The ship had left New York City weeks earlier, bound for Genoa, Italy. The captain, Benjamin Briggs, was an experienced sailor, and there was no reason to suspect trouble. Yet, when a passing ship discovered the Mary Celeste, its lifeboat was gone, and the crew's belongings were untouched. Adding to the mystery, the ship's logbook stopped abruptly 10 days before it was found, and some barrels of alcohol were missing. Conspiracy theories abound: pirate attacks, mutiny, and even sea monsters. However, a curious detail: sailors on other ships later reported ghostly figures near the coordinates where the Mary Celeste was abandoned. Was it fear of a supernatural force that drove the crew to their demise. In 2008, Brandon Swanson, 19, was driving home in rural Minnesota when his car got stuck in a ditch. Calling his parents for help, he described his location and said he would walk toward a town's lights visible in the distance. His parents stayed on the phone with him for nearly an hour, but Brandon seemed disoriented. At one point, he exclaimed, "Oh no," and the line went dead. Despite exhaustive searches, no trace of Brandon or his belongings was ever found. The eerie twist, multiple witnesses in the area later reported seeing strange lights in the sky that night. Could Brandon have encountered something otherworldly? Others speculate he fell into an abandoned well or was taken by someone lurking in the shadows. Whatever the truth, his final words remain haunting. On Christmas Eve 1945, a fire consumed the Sauter family home in Fayetteville, West Virginia. George and Jenny Sauter escaped with 4 of their 10 children, but 5 were never found. Investigators concluded they perished in the fire, yet no human remains were ever discovered, even after extensive searches. Suspiciously, the telephone lines to the house had been cut, and a ladder typically kept on the property was missing. Years later, Jenny received a photograph of a young man resembling her missing son, with a cryptic note written on the back. Private detectives followed leads but never solved the case. The chilling twist, locals whispered of a mafia connection, claiming the children were kidnapped in retaliation for George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini. To this day, the fate of the Sauter children remains a haunting mystery, with their photographs still displayed on a family billboard, pleading for answers. Three lighthouse keepers, Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur, disappeared from Eilean Moor without a trace. When a relief team arrived, they found the lighthouse in working order. A meal was half-eaten on the table, and 2 of the men's oilskins were gone, suggesting they'd ventured outside. But the third man's coat was still hanging up. The only clue was Marshall's cryptic journal entries, "Severe winds, the likes of which I have never seen." James is very quiet, Donald weeps. However, weather reports from the mainland indicated calm conditions. In 2020, forensic meteorologists revealed the area had no storms recorded that year, confirming the entries were either fabrications or the result of shared hallucinations. Locals believe the men fell victim to the Blue Men of the Minch, mythical sea creatures known to lure sailors to their deaths. Others argue the mystery lies within Marshall's journal. Its ink contains traces of an unknown hallucinogenic fungus. After their 2 daughters, Joanna and Jacqueline, tragically died in a car accident, John and Florence Pollock were devastated. A year later, Florence gave birth to twins, Jennifer and Jillian. As they grew, the twins began recalling details of their late sisters' lives, including events and places they had never seen. Jennifer had a birthmark identical to Jacqueline's scar, and the twins displayed identical fears and preferences as their deceased siblings. They even remembered specific details about the fatal accident. When the twins turned 5, all memories of their past lives disappeared. A psychologist suggested they were merely repeating stories overheard from their parents. But one eerie fact remained unresolved. The twins knew the exact location of a hidden toy their parents had buried years earlier, a toy belonging to Joanna and Jacqueline. It was pouring rain when Jake made his way down the dark rural highway. He had just finished a long shift at the factory and was desperate to get home. The wind howled as he drove, his headlights cutting through the thick rain. It had been a miserable evening, and he wished he had stayed home. Suddenly, as he rounded a bend, he saw a figure in the rain standing at the side of the road, thumb outstretched. The figure was a man, drenched and wearing a worn-out jacket. Jake hesitated for a moment. He wasn't one to pick up hitchhikers, but something about the man's desperate stance made him feel guilty. He stopped the car, rolling down the passenger window just enough to hear him. The man explained he had been stranded for hours, waiting for help. He seemed harmless enough, so Jake reluctantly unlocked the door and motioned for him to get in. The man climbed in, dripping wet, and muttered a quick thanks before settling into the seat. As they drove, Jake made small talk, but the man remained eerily quiet, his eyes fixed ahead. Something felt wrong. Every so often, Jake would glance over at him, only to find the man staring intently at him, his eyes wide and unblinking. The rain continued to pour harder, and Jake's unease grew. He didn't want to be rude, but wished he could just get to a populated area. After a few tense minutes, he turned to ask the man if he had a destination in mind. But when he looked over, the passenger seat was empty. The man was gone. Jake slammed on the brakes and stopped the car, his heart pounding in his chest. He was alone, soaking wet in the rain, with no trace of the hitchhiker. He searched the area for a few minutes, but there was no sign of anyone, no footprints in the mud, no shelter where the man could have gone. Shaken, he continued home, unable to explain the inexplicable encounter. That night, while lying in bed, he heard faint knocks at his window, but when he got up to check, there was nothing. It was a dreary, cold afternoon, and Sarah was walking home from work, tired from the day's events. The rain had started falling heavily, so she pulled her coat tighter around her, her footsteps echoing on the nearly empty street. She preferred walking in the rain. Something about the calmness of the wet world brought her peace. But that day, the usual comfort was replaced by a creeping sense of unease. As she walked down the long, deserted street, she noticed something strange. Up ahead, in the dim light of the street lamp, there was a figure standing under the awning of an old store, looking in her direction. She thought little of it, assuming it was just someone trying to stay dry. But as she drew closer, something felt off. The figure stood still, unmoving, just watching her. When Sarah was about 5 feet away, the figure abruptly stepped into the rain, walking directly toward her. That's when she realized it was not a person at all. The figure's face was pale, almost unnaturally white, and its eyes seemed black as the night. She quickened her pace, heart racing. As she turned to glance back, the figure was no longer in sight. Her nerves on edge, she continued walking, trying to shake off the strange encounter. But as she neared her apartment building, she saw it again, standing at the corner of the street, watching her. This time, it didn't step forward. It just stood there, unmoving. Sarah ran the last few feet to her door, locking it behind her. That night, she heard tapping on the windows, though she was certain no one was outside. The next morning, the street was completely empty, no figure, no rain-soaked footsteps leading to her apartment. Rachel had always walked past the old, abandoned house on her way home from the grocery store. It had been empty for years, its windows boarded up, the garden overgrown. She never paid it much attention, figuring it was just another decaying building. But that night, as she trudged through the rain, something was different. The house stood in complete darkness, save for one light, a flickering light from a single window on the second floor. It seemed out of place. Intrigued and a little unnerved, Rachel walked closer, her boots splashing through the puddles. The light flickered again and then went out, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. She had just passed the house when she heard something. A sound, soft at first, then louder. It was the sound of footsteps following her, echoing in the rain. Startled, she turned around, but there was no one in sight. She quickened her pace, but the sound continued. Step by step, it matched her movements. Her heart raced as she glanced over her shoulder again. Then, in the dim light of a street lamp, she saw it. A shadow, moving swiftly toward her from the direction of the old house. Rachel froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness, and seemed to be following her. She sprinted the rest of the way home, reaching her apartment building with the shadow still close behind. When she entered her apartment and locked the door, she felt a chill wash over her. There on the windowsill was a small, damp footprint, and in the reflection, standing just outside, was a figure still watching her. The rain had been falling for hours, turning the streets into rivers of glistening black pavement. Jason pulled his hood tighter over his head and adjusted his backpack. It was late, nearly midnight, but he had no choice. The last bus had already left, and his only option was to walk the 3 miles home. At first, the rain didn't bother him. The rhythmic patter against his hood was oddly calming, and the empty streets felt peaceful. The only sounds were the occasional distant honk of a car and the squelch of his sneakers against the wet pavement. But after a while, something shifted. As he turned onto a dimly lit side street, he heard footsteps. Not his own. Jason paused for a moment, straining to listen. The rain made it hard to tell where the sound was coming from. He turned around, expecting to see someone walking behind him. The street was empty. A single flickering street lamp cast an eerie glow, but there was no sign of another person. Shaking it off as paranoia, he continued walking. Then there it was again. Tap, tap, tap. Someone was behind him. He was sure of it now. The sound was distinct, just a few paces back, perfectly in sync with his steps. He sped up, his heart pounding, and the footsteps matched his pace. His breath hitched. Was someone following him? Forcing himself not to panic, he stole a quick glance over his shoulder. Nothing. The street was still empty, but the footsteps hadn't stopped. Jason took a sharp turn into an alleyway, hoping to shake off whatever, or whoever was behind him. He pressed himself against the brick wall, holding his breath. The rain dripped from the fire escapes above, the cold water trickling down his neck. Silence. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then, just as he was about to step back onto the main road, he heard it again. The footsteps. But they weren't behind him anymore. They were in front of him. A dark figure stood at the other end of the alley, motionless. Jason's stomach dropped. The figure was tall, shrouded in a long coat, its face obscured by the shadows. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there. Jason's breath came in short gasps. He turned on his heel and sprinted back the way he came. He didn't look back, he couldn't. He just ran, his feet pounding against the wet pavement. The streets blurred past him, the rain stinging his skin. When he reached his apartment building, he fumbled with the keys, hands shaking as he forced the door open. He slammed it shut behind him, twisting the lock. His chest heaved. He leaned against the door, listening. The only sound was the heavy downpour outside. And then, just as he exhaled in relief, he saw a wet footprint on the floor. When I was 9 years old, my grandmother passed away unexpectedly. She was the heart of our family, a kind woman who always made time for everyone, especially me. Losing her felt like losing a part of myself. After her funeral, I couldn't stop crying. I missed her hugs, her voice, and the way she called me her little star. My parents said she was in a better place, but I didn't feel comforted. The first time I saw her again was a week after her funeral. It was late at night, and I had trouble sleeping. My bedroom faced the backyard, and through my window I could see the garden where she used to spend hours planting flowers and herbs. That night I woke up suddenly. The room felt unusually cold, even though it was summer. I remember sitting up in bed and looking out the window. That's when I saw her. She was standing in the garden, wearing the same floral dress she always loved. The moonlight illuminated her face, and she looked just as she did when she was alive, except there was a softness about her, an almost glowing presence. I froze, unable to move or speak. She didn't look frightening, but there was something deeply unsettling about seeing her there, knowing she was gone. She looked up at my window, her eyes meeting mine. She smiled, a gentle, familiar smile, and raised her hand as if to wave. I wanted to call out to her, but my voice wouldn't come. Instead, I sat there, staring, until she slowly turned and walked toward the back of the garden, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't tell anyone at first. I thought they'd say it was just a dream or my imagination. But a week later, it happened again. This time, I was in the kitchen, helping my mom bake cookies, something I used to do with my grandmother all the time. As I reached for the rolling pin, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned around expecting to see my mom, but no one was there. Before I could say anything, I caught a faint whiff of lavender, her favorite scent. It was so distinct that it made me tear up. "Did you smell that?" I asked my mom. "Smell what?" she replied, distracted by the dough. I didn't push it, but deep down I knew it was her. The last time I saw her was a month later. I was home alone, sitting in the living room, flipping through an old photo album. I had opened it to a picture of us in the garden, taken just a year before she passed. As I stared at the photo, the room grew quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, almost unnatural. Then I heard it, her voice. "Don't be sad, my little star." I looked up, and she was there, standing by the doorway. She looked more radiant than ever, almost otherworldly, but there was no mistaking it. This was my grandmother. "I'm okay," she said softly, "and you will be too." Tears streamed down my face as I tried to reach out to her, but my hand passed through nothing. She smiled again, a bittersweet expression, and slowly faded away. When my parents came home that evening, I finally told them everything. My mom was quiet for a long time before saying, "I believe you. She loved you so much, maybe she just needed to say goodbye." I never saw her again after that night, but I still feel her presence sometimes when I smell lavender or when I'm in the garden planting flowers. It's not scary anymore. If anything, it feels like she's watching over me, just as she promised. It was a cold evening in early December when I first saw the ghost of my aunt. She had passed away 2 months earlier after a long battle with cancer. My family was still mourning, and it felt as though an emptiness had settled over our home. One night, I woke up to a soft tapping on my bedroom door. Half asleep, I assumed it was my mother asking if I needed anything, so I opened the door without thinking. To my surprise, I found no one standing there, but the faint scent of my aunt's favorite perfume lingered in the hallway, something my mom had stopped wearing after her passing. Confused but curious, I walked downstairs thinking maybe I'd find her there. As I passed the living room, I froze. There, in the dim light from the street lamp outside, I saw my aunt sitting on the old couch she loved. She was wearing the same sweater she had on the day she passed, her hair neatly combed, and her gaze directed towards me, as if she were waiting for me. My heart raced, and I backed away slowly. But just as I turned to run, I heard her soft, familiar voice whisper, "It's okay, I'm still here." The moment I turned around, she was gone. I could never explain what happened that night, but I felt a sense of peace afterward, as if my aunt had visited to reassure me that she was watching over us. It was a rainy night when I saw my cousin's ghost. She had passed away in a tragic accident the year before, and her death had left a hole in the family that was impossible to fill. I was staying at my grandmother's house, where my cousin had lived, and even though it had been months since the funeral, her absence still felt fresh. That night, I woke up to the sound of knocking on my bedroom door. Groggy, I got out of bed thinking it was my cousin Sarah wanting to tell me something funny she had remembered. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. I checked the time, 3:00 a.m. Suddenly, a cold breeze passed by me, and I heard faint footsteps coming from the kitchen. When I followed the sound, I froze in shock. Standing by the kitchen table was my cousin. She was dressed in the same clothes she had worn the day of her accident, her face pale, but with an oddly serene expression. Her eyes locked with mine, and for a brief moment I felt like time stood still. "I didn't mean to scare you," she whispered softly, her voice sounding distant. "I just wanted to say goodbye properly." Before I could say anything, she turned and walked into the shadows of the hallway, disappearing completely. I stood there, unable to move, my heart pounding in my chest. The next day, I asked my grandmother if she had seen anything strange during the night. She looked at me, her face solemn, and said, "Your cousin came to visit me last night too. We both agreed that Sarah's visit, though terrifying, was her way of finding peace after she had left us too soon. It was early autumn, and I had just returned to my childhood home after several years of being away. The house had been quiet since my uncle's sudden passing the year before. He had been a strong, steadfast figure in our family, and his unexpected death had left a deep hole in all of us. My aunt, his wife, was still grieving, and I could feel the heaviness in the air when I entered. One evening, while staying at their house, I decided to stay up late and do some work on my laptop in the living room. It was about 11 p.m., and the house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floor. My aunt had gone to bed early, and the sound of a light breeze brushing through the trees outside was the only noise I could hear. As I worked, I noticed a shadow in the corner of my eye, just outside the window. I assumed it was the reflection of a tree moving in the wind, but then I saw it again. This time, it was clearer, a figure standing just outside the window. The chill in the room seemed to grow colder. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if my mind was playing tricks on me, but something compelled me to stand up and look closer. I slowly approached the window, heart pounding in my chest. As I peered out into the darkness, the figure became more defined. It was a man, tall and wearing a worn coat. For a brief moment, I thought it might be someone trying to get my attention, but then I saw his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and vacant, like he was staring through me. My blood ran cold. The figure was unmistakable. It was my uncle, but I knew he had passed away. I took a step back, my breath caught in my throat, and the figure slowly began to fade, as if dissolving into the night. The next morning, I told my aunt about what had happened, and she went silent for a long moment. Finally, she spoke softly, saying, "He always loved to stand by that window and watch the night. Sometimes I can feel him near. Maybe he was just checking on you." We never spoke much about it again, but I knew that whatever I had seen was real, whether it was a ghost, a memory, or something else entirely. It was a visit from someone who hadn't truly left.